All right, everyone, thank you for joining us for this exciting Lunch and Learn seminar. My name is Eric Kozlik. I am the host of the Modern Bar Cart podcasts. I'm based out of Washington, D.C. So a lot of the distillers and bars and brands that I work with are based in the Mid-Atlantic. So do a lot of work with Maryland distillers, some Virginia distillers, and D.C. distillers as well. And the topic of today's presentation is about how to do bartender competitions in a way that makes sense for your operation. I want to do a little bit of quick housekeeping before I dive right in. Some of these slides might not be hyper legible for you, especially if you're sitting in the back. I'm happy to make this available to you in PDF form or whatever. So come up, grab my card, grab my contact info after we chat if you'd like access to it. The goal was to have this not just be like a set of slides, but also a guide that you can kind of read through if you're considering doing some of these types of competitions for your own brand or a brand that you're perhaps consulting with. So don't focus on reading all of the small print on slides where there's a lot of writing. Don't stress too much about that. The other thing I will say is that we're going to be talking about 3 types of cocktail competitions in this seminar. One of those types, the big, huge blowout, like corporate types, we're really not going to spend a whole lot of time on just because those are not the most common that you're going to run across. They're the most, if this were a seminar for bartenders, that would absolutely be the type of cocktail competition that we focus on. But because this is a distiller and brand focused seminar, we're going to spend most of our time talking about digital cocktail competitions and then the kind of medium-sized cocktail competitions that are single-day events that are typically run by brands who have distillery spaces or who partner with other venues like bars or hotels to host these types of live events. So with that being said, let's jump in. Feel free to interrupt me with questions as we go. But my goal is to be efficient enough with this that we'll have time at the end for questions. And we do have somebody who will run around with a mic for the Q&A. So if it's not super pressing, if the slide is not completely unintelligible, maybe save it for the end. So especially after COVID, in this time when we're all sitting around and saying like, oh wow, like we can actually have events again. You know, it's tempting to look at the cocktail competitions that are going on, especially if you happen to follow your local bartenders in the cities around you or the big cocktail markets around you, and you see them going to these big events and competing. It's easy to look at that and be like, oh, wow, a cocktail competition. We haven't been able to do that sort of thing for several years now. This is suddenly very attractive again. All reports that I've been hearing is that tasting room traffic is down-ish, maybe not down a crazy amount. Maybe you're one of the exceptions and it's up for you, but by and large, I'm getting reports that tasting room traffic is a little down from pre-COVID levels. And so one of the open questions for brands and distillers is, well, how do we get this back up? A cocktail competition is a great way to do that. And so you look at all this stuff that you see with these fancy competitions on social media, and it's like, well, if these brands can do it, why can't we? And the answer is, well, you certainly can. But in my experience, running cocktail competitions is a tricky balancing act because it's something that you inherently want to do a number of times. This is going to be a sort of a refrain for this presentation, is that you want any efforts that you put into your cocktail competitions to be repeatable so that you can make improvements and do it again the next year and have sort of this recurring flywheel style value cycle where people get excited about this, bartenders get excited about it, and your brand can kind of use this as an event that gets more valuable and, more importantly, more efficient every time you do it. So it's easy to say, oh, look at all these big guys doing it. I bet we can do our version of that. And so hopefully as we go here, you'll be able to narrow in on what your version of that might look like. Some of the problems, just to kind of identify them here at the outset, especially for events where you are running these in a distillery space or a bar or hotel venue. Once you commit to doing a cocktail competition, there's actually a lot of administrative work that needs to happen, right? You need to select a format, right? This isn't just like bartenders are going to show up and automatically know how to compete for you. You have to set some guidelines. You have to select a format that's going to work not only for your space, but for the types of products that you're trying to promote. If you're a distillery that makes a bunch of different types of products, your competition is going to inherently look much different than if you are a distillery that produces a single type of product or even a single SKU if you're a brand. We'll have an example of that for our digital cocktail competitions in a moment here. Bartenders, they're great. We all love them. But when they're not serving us at the bar, they have a reputation that is reasonably well earned in my experience for being a little bit hard to wrangle. In addition to that, if you're having judges, you need to figure out who your judges are going to be. You're going to need to figure out how to get them all there and get them all on the same page of how they're evaluating these cocktails that are made. And then on the day of the event, there's a lot of work to do. And if you're a small team, there's just a ton of work that can kind of bloat out over the course of up to a week or two before the event that may disrupt other things that are kind of the course of normal operations for your facility. So there's a lot of stuff to take into account here, and hopefully the case studies that I have for you will allow us to get into some of those. So first we're going to cover the types of cocktail competitions. Then I'll go into more of the nitty-gritty of planning a successful live event. I personally have been involved in cocktail competitions on a number of levels. I've been a judge for cocktail competitions, I've been an MC for them, and I've also been kind of like a partner with the distillers in planning some of these and in kind of going back over previous events and saying, how can we improve these? So I've kind of covered all the different bases of running and participating in cocktail competitions. So hopefully we'll have a kind of a 360 view of it in that respect. And then at the end of the presentation, I do want to take a moment to talk about measuring value. I kind of alluded to it earlier, but there's sort of this cyclical and recurrent value flow that all good cocktail competitions have. So I'm going to sort of teach you how to perceive that, how to recognize it, and then also how to kind of plan it into the events that you might try to host. So moving on to the types of cocktail competitions. From the most basic right now, the lightest lift, I would say, is a purely digital cocktail competition. Of course, during COVID, we saw these kind of explode. Everybody was on social media running cocktail competitions. There were some good ones. There were some that were maybe a little less efficient. Digital competitions can be fantastic, specifically because in the digital space, you have the power, if you're smart about the way you plan it, to gather a tremendous amount of data, both quantitative and qualitative. So if you're looking for feedback, if you're a newer brand especially, digital events are fantastic. Live events, a little bit more involved in terms of the physical logistics and the costs, right? We can cap our costs in the digital space pretty efficiently. If you tell social media to stop spending money on ads, it stops spending money on those ads. But once you plan a live event, the costs associated with that are a little bit less in your control, because once you've got those ticket sales, those people are going to show up no matter what. So there may be some unplanned for contingencies that need to come out of your bank account. And then finally, the multi-round event. As I mentioned, we're not going to spend a ton of time on these. I'm happy to come and chat with you if you're interested in running one of these big, what we might call enterprise events. The way I think about these is like if you've ever bought software and you've clicked on their pricing page, they're like, well, here's the single user price, here's the multi-user price, and oh, by the way, we're not even going to tell you how expensive the enterprise package is. You're going to have to call us for that pricing. So this would be like the Diageo world-class style events, events run by brands that are owned by large international conglomerates. So I do have some resources on these events, and I'm happy to chat about them individually with you. So let's dive in, starting with the digital cocktail competitions. As I mentioned, definitely the most affordable type. When you're planning a digital cocktail competition, you need to figure out where the digital competition is going to take place. Is it, the answer is probably social media, right? But each of the platforms that you use are going to have different constraints, right? And when it comes to gathering the value that you want to eventually collect from these types of events, you really need to be very, very careful about how you go about setting this up, right? Because if you choose the wrong platform, or if you're not able to, like, for example, if even if you don't have your, like, a great example of this would be if you don't have your Instagram page set up as a professional account that has this extra level of data granularity that you can get. If you're an emerging brand, you might not know that you have to do this, right? So when you, even though digital competitions can feel like, all right, we're just going to test the waters here, we're going to do a social media competition, we're going to blast this out to our email list, we're going to run a social media campaign to see if we can get professional bartenders or home bartenders engaged with this, and we're just going to see what happens. I'm here to tell you that that is not going to allow you to collect the kind of data that will leave you at the end of the competition able to do something with it. And ultimately, at the end of the day, if you're going to commit to spending your resources on an event like this, whether it's digital or in person, you want to be able to either look at the bank account and say, hey, I was able to make this deposit, or I gained this many new bar accounts from this event, or hey, we got this many new followers from this competition. So if you're not tracking things, you're not going to be able to do that, and it's going to be, when the dust settles, you're going to be in this kind of like limbo feeling. And I've seen it happen to brands before where they're like, and then they never run a cocktail competition again, which means you just sunk almost the entire cost of that first competition. So really, with a digital event or a physical one, we're trying to get not just the first competition done, but we're trying to almost get ready and plan for that second competition and get that flywheel of value turning, both for you and, as we'll talk about later, for the bartenders that you engage. So getting a little bit more granular here, you do want to figure out, if you're running a digital competition, you're dealing with professional bartenders or perhaps with home bartenders. For some brands, it makes way more sense. If you are an on-premise style brand, it makes a lot of sense for you to target professional bartenders as the people you want to compete in your competition. Now, on the other hand, if you're more of a social media brand, there's a great account out there called the Home Bar Awards, run by my friend Chris Kurtz. And he was not a distiller, he's a cocktail enthusiast, and his goal was just to gain traction for this account. And how he did that was by running monthly cocktail competitions specifically targeted at home bartenders. Two different sets of goals. It's really important for you to be able to define who your bartenders are going to be. At the same time, you want to find your audience. And obviously, with the integration between Instagram and Facebook, you have a creepy level of granularity in terms of being able to hone in on the demographics of your users, right? So it makes sense for you if you have a social media manager, or if you are the person who is running the social media for your brand, it makes sense to be able to ask that question, who is my audience? And then go into the actual analytics of your platform and see if the data actually match your assumptions, right? Because if they don't match your assumptions, then maybe your outreach, your digital outreach, and the impact of this competition is not going to be what you assume it will be. And then, of course, there's the value. The digital competition is a little problematic in terms of how much value you can actually measure. Of course, you can measure impressions. But in the marketing world, sometimes impressions are referred to as a, quote, vanity metric, in that just because you get a view on Instagram doesn't mean it moves the needle in your bank account, right? So of course you're going to want to find the easy ways, the easy hooks and places where the social media platforms allow you to measure that value, allow you to measure views, allow you to measure new followers, for example. Those are valuable. But also to consider, like, hey, if we're going to be forwarding these folks to our e-commerce platform, right, Reserve Bar or something like that, is there any way we can use a specific trackable link specifically for this competition, where if somebody clicks through from the competition webpage or from our social media profile that we have running during this competition, using that link, can we capture that? Can we attribute that bottle purchase to this effort that we've done? Because again, once the dust settles and you go and try to measure this, those attributions of actual sales or actual followers are going to be really valuable for you in terms of being able to justify doing another event and not having it be a one-time event that's kind of a sunk cost. Now, that being said, we're going to look at a case study that's a great example of a one-time event that did not end up being a sunk cost at all. This case study is of Ming River Baijiu, run by my friend Derek Sandhouse, and the historical context of this event is really important because it was run during COVID. And obviously COVID is a special circumstance, something we hope not to repeat. So it makes sense why they went about this competition the way they did. They called it their quarantine cocktail competition. And one of the creative things that they did that I want to point out as a great strategy for brands here is that instead of paying bartenders money, which is ethically maybe a little suspect, especially on such a public online forum as a cocktail competition on your social media, it's maybe a little suspect to give cash prizes to bartenders, but it's certainly not suspect to donate to charity, because of course then those donations become deductions that you can make. So creative ways of going about the prize structure like that are always great for brands to consider. The goals of this competition going into it, I was able to interview Derek and he shared this with me. He said that he wanted to engage home bartenders and unemployed bartenders. So his audience, kind of like the audience of the Modern Bar Cart podcast, is kind of almost split right down the middle. He wanted to get Ming River Baijiu in the hands of people who were non-industry. And luckily at that time, this is when those digital e-com platforms were really starting to pop off. And so he had that all set up. He was able to ship bottles right to people's doorsteps. It was early on in the popularity of that. And he could ship to most states, I believe. DC, by the way, is a great place to base your shipping efforts from if you want to be able to ship to a lot of places. So he wanted to hit those home bartenders, but he also, he does quite a bit with on-premise bartenders, especially in the Mid-Atlantic. He's really involved with that, with Bar Convent Brooklyn, events like that. And so he saw all of these bartenders whom he was following unemployed and at home, and he said, well, great. What if we can get these unemployed bartenders up, kind of mobilized, and in front of all these home bartenders whom we hope to maybe make progress with, to get our product in front of more of these at-home folks. And another creative way they went about not paying bartenders was that and making the competition easier for the bartenders to justify doing, so that they weren't pouring expenses out of their own pockets, was to provide an Instacart allowance. Pretty easy. And so the takeaways for this competition, the way that it was structured was they pre-vetted bartenders from around the country, and I think they selected something like 16, and they did like a Sweet 16 bracket style thing. This was not too long after March Madness. It was in like April, I believe, so the whole bracket mentality was still fresh in people's minds. So they did, they basically every day for the course of about a month, they had on their social media, they paired one of these bartenders' cocktails against another, and they had their social media fans vote. And they had all these other kind of things where, you know, they had people, asking to, they had their bartenders asking to tag people, and you know, it was a good way to leverage the bartenders' themselves to get the bartenders networks to also participate in this and kind of thereby follow Ming River and swell their own influence. And then finally, when they got down to 4 finalists, they had to record not just, they couldn't just take a snapshot of their cocktail. If they made it to that final 4, they then had to record a video of themselves actually making the cocktail and engaging with the audience. So it wasn't just, by the time they got down to the finals, it wasn't just these static pictures going up against one another like people had gotten used to over the course of the previous weeks. They actually found a way to escalate the competition. And also, what you'll notice there is that they had the bartenders create more digital assets for them. That is one of the biggest strengths of a digital cocktail competition, is that you can get other people to create digital assets that you can then use in perpetuity. And if you're a small brand, if you don't have the money to hire a photographer, if you don't have the resources to, get a company to run your social media for you, just having other people create digital assets using your product with the label facing out and a beautiful cocktail next to it is super valuable. Now, I will say as an aside here, it's great if you have a competition like this to be able to have some sort of guidelines where people, kind of like when you were walking up the ramp here and you pass that sign where it says, by passing this point, you understand that you are being recorded with photo and video and potentially audio or whatever. It's good to have almost like a participation clause in your competition saying that, hey, basically, if you're going to be submitting this digital content to us, it becomes ours, and we can use the recipe, any of the photo and video content that you create. It's also great to be able to attribute it to them and not do it in a crummy way, and to give back some value to them. But you do want to make sure that, especially in these digital cocktail competition styles, you are collecting those digital assets, because outside of the likes and the subscribes and any of the potential sales that you can attribute using a trackable link, those digital assets are going to be the things that give you value again and again. And that's part of the flywheel I'm talking about. If you can repurpose things that save you time and money, that's where you can get a lot of value out of these. So qualitatively, this was a real good look for Ming River. It showed that they cared about bartenders and that they were actually engaging with them and cared about them at a time when it felt like the industry was falling down, collapsing around their ears. And Derek said specifically that the social aspect of it was almost as, if not more important than the media aspect. Of course, this was a media play, but he wanted the bartenders who poured his products at bars to be able to go back after COVID and continue pouring his product and have good feelings about that brand. And in terms of the actual impact of it, they grew their followers about 40%, from 6,000 to 8,500 in less than 2 months. That, without the aid of, they had an in-house social media person running this, but without spending a tremendous amount, that's a huge jump. That's a huge spike. And the nice thing about that jump in subscribers is that it's not something that happened overnight. These are not subscribers that you paid for and then you wake up and suddenly you have 10,000 new bots following you. These are all valuable, active, real people who were invested in that competition that they were doing. And hopefully, you would presume that as Ming River continues to grow and evolve, those people are going to continue to care about that brand. Any questions on digital events? This is a good place, I think, maybe to pause.
How do you track sales from that?
Yeah, so the question is, how do we track sales from a digital event? The best way, as I mentioned, is e-com. To have Reserve Bar, have something like that where you can go direct to consumer, and then to have a trackable link, something like a tiny URL or a bit.ly, where you can put that link on the web page for that event, and any clicks that go through that you can attribute. That's the other problem with the digital space. The digital space has a low cost to entry, but when there's a low cost to entry, there's a lot of stuff that leaks out without your control. So, it's an inherently dissatisfying question because you know you're not capturing all the value, right? So digital competitions, ultimately, I really like them as a way not only to grow your social media following, but also to gather qualitative information, because over the course of running this, you're going to get some feedback from the bartenders and you're going to get some feedback from the audience that may help you in product development. It may help with packaging, and especially when if you're an early phase brand that doesn't have a lot of knowledge or expertise in the cocktail space, this is super valuable for you because you have people who know what they're talking about telling you what you should be doing cocktail wise. So you don't have to come up with a bad cocktail and pretend and have people pretend to like it in your tasting room. You can have somebody come up with a pretty darn good one and then simply attribute it to them, and they get a big kick out of that, right? That's a very easy thing to give a bartender, is attribution on your tasting room or cocktail bar menu. They love that. That is so big, especially for bartenders who are using these events as a way to build their own resumes, which is something that happens more as you get into these live in-person events and sort of like what I call the enterprise events. So let's move on to those live single day events. These are great for craft distilleries. And I should throw in a disclaimer here that both in the digital space and in the physical space, you should probably spend some time before you launch, you definitely, before you launch your event, should spend time considering the legal ramifications of what you're doing. Every state has different laws about what you can pour, when you can pour it, how you can do it. As I mentioned in the digital space, there's probably some laws, and it's just plain old a bad look to be giving cash prizes out to bartenders for repping your liquor brand online. So these are some of the things that you want to do a deep dive on before you commit to the format. I know in certain states, for example, there are constraints that may even dissuade you from doing a live competition. For example, only being able to mix with products that you make on the premises. So there's a lot of states with some archaic laws like that. That's going to constrain you. Maybe then that's the type of event you want to partner with a host that can, pour cocktails using, yes, your stuff, but also other types of ingredients, so that your bartenders aren't hamstrung with, your bottle of whiskey and maybe like a simple syrup that you make in-house. So look at the legality constraints before you commit to the type of event you're going to run, and also take those into consideration while kind of creating the structure of the event. When I say medium expense and local value, essentially what I mean here is that the logistics of a live in-person event, whether it's at your distillery or at a partner venue like a bar or a hotel, you're going to have to shell out for it before you see any value back. In a way that you don't have to as much with the digital competition. Digital competitions, you can throw time and sweat equity at. You have to throw not only sweat equity, but also some cash at a live event before people even buy tickets. So a little bit more expensive. And when I say local value, for a lot of craft distilleries, if you're looking to build value, you're looking to do it in the communities where you distribute and where you have influence. You're looking to have this event reflect on you as a good actor in your community and as a place where people can go to have fun, as a place where people, want to take their friends. And if you're working with local bartenders, who are the people who are inevitably kind of gonna be the ones you rely on in these medium-sized events, you're also looking to strengthen your relationship with them as a brand and see if you can get them to be informal brand ambassadors for you at their own bars, and to push for using your spirits when there's a menu change or when they have seasonal featured cocktails. You want them to first be thinking of your spirits. So that's the kind of value and expense I'm talking about with these local events. These are the types of events where I have the most experience. And just like with a digital event, you do need some sort of dedicated team. The dedicated team here looks a lot different and has to wear many different kind of hats, especially if you're a small operation. day of execution on these events is super critical, because what people don't see for these live events is all the work that you put into it on the back end, which is very important. They see what the distillery or the venue looks like day of. They see how smooth it ran. They see the bartenders, and if the bartenders are frustrated with the event, they're watching those people perform. And if those people are rolling their eyes because you ran out of ice a third of the way through the event and they can't make chilled cocktails, that's going to reflect on the audience. So day of execution is really, really important. And I do actually have a run of show document. I didn't upload it here because it's clunky in the slideshow format, but I do have a run of show template that if anybody is interested in creating an event like this, come get my contact info after this and I'll be happy to send you that run of show template. It's a great way to structure that to-do list and keep things running in a timely manner, which is super important. When it comes to partnering with other venues, right? Let's say you're trying to create a cocktail competition in a state or a jurisdiction where you are not able to offer bartenders a full back bar of mixing materials at your own space for whatever legal reason. Great. Let's partner with a bar, let's partner with a hotel. Unfortunately, that also increases the logistical complexity of it, because you don't have control necessarily over their space, and you don't always know, some of their own operating policies that are going to, influence the shape of the event, the flow of bodies, and the ability of the bartenders to do what they need to do. So it's a great opportunity, and it's also that kind of local, that's also another type of local value. If you can partner with a bar, that's a great way to get, to build equity with them and make sure that if they're pouring a lot of cocktails that, hey, wow, remember that event? Those guys really killed it. We should make sure that on our new fall menu that we're featuring their whiskey. Great. Another way to just build some good karma with local partners. So on one hand, a little bit more complicated, a little bit less control for you. On the other hand, you can build some good relationships out of it. Again, kind of the same questions, but they look a little bit different for a live event as compared to a digital event. Who are my bartenders? Well, as I mentioned, if you're a craft distillery, they're probably going to be local. We really only start to fly people in when we're Diageo, right? So these are going to be local bartenders in your market. And the nice thing is, as I mentioned, I'm based in DC, so I've seen these competitions held in DC, which would be considered a large primary market. We have a really solid cocktail scene with some really incredibly talented bartenders. And then you drive 45 minutes or an hour outside of DC to a lot of these distilleries that I work with, and these, what I would call secondary markets, have a good cocktail scene. They have an enthusiastic customer base who's interested in drinking cocktails, but the bartenders are definitely 1 or 2 steps below the type of talent and just like execution potential compared to the ones who are operating in the primary market. These are things that you just want to be walking in eyes wide open with. And we can talk during our case study about kind of like how that shook out, because we made some interesting tweaks in this case study that were kind of based on the types of bartenders that we ended up using for this event. Who's your audience? Well, it's going to be, in the case of a live event, it's going to look a lot like the people who come into your doors on the weekends or whenever you're open for tastings and tours. These are going to be your super fans in all likelihood. There's not too many craft venues who can have a lot more than 200 or 300 people max at the facility. And if that's the case, you're most likely going to see a lot of overlap with the people who are already highly engaged with your brand. And the goal here, just like it is with the bartenders, is to show these people a good time and turn them into not just your old reliables, but your super ambassadors, to have them bring their friends, and then to have those friends be like, oh man, I was visiting X over the weekend and they took us to this event and it just blew us away. So you want to take these people who are already like the people who are supporting you and whom you may be able to, if you have an advanced social media game, be able to kind of target through Facebook and, kind of get those people through Eventbrite to buy tickets early on for your event. But the nice thing about local events is that the bartenders and the audience are both sort of known entities. So what that allows you to do is, if you've got known knowns, you can focus on efficiency and the value that you want to get out of it. And of course, we mentioned the value earlier. You want to get butts in seats, so to speak. You want to get people in your distillery, and you want to get them coming back and bringing their friends, who will then hopefully also purchase bottles. This is a special slide, a list of takeaways that I found from running these events. Bartenders, when you're coordinating with them, they will take 2 to 3 times longer to respond than you think they will, if they respond at all. That is a given. They will not read the rules that you send them. You need to make rules. It's very important. They won't read them. They will ask stupid questions. They will show up way later than you asked them to on the day of. They will have just woken up. And they have big egos, and they need to be handled gently in many cases. A lot of the bartenders who want to attend these events and use them as resume builders are up and coming. They're young people who want to make a name for themselves, and this is great. You want to help them do that. It is in your best interest to help them do that. They can then become informal, unpaid brand ambassadors for you. That is a really good return on investment for you. And so even though they need to be handled gently, and it may be it might feel like HR for somebody who doesn't actually work for you, but they are nonetheless the stars of the show. And so part of, when I mentioned that the person or the team who is spearheading these live in-person events, they need to wear many hats. One of those kind of hats that maybe you wouldn't necessarily expect them to have to wear is kind of like that HR manager, cat wrangler type of hat. That's one of the most important ones. Guests, they will very rapidly get drunker than you want them to. They will always look for ways to game any audience participation vote that you allow. Now, don't get me wrong, I love audience participation votes because it gives you plausible deniability for your bartenders. It means that you can, in certain cases, avoid having to have judges, which is an extra layer of complexity. But as soon as you give them an opportunity to try and vote or stuff the ballot box for somebody, they're going to do that. So it's good to kind of think of ways to make sure that your voting process, if you do have any audience participation, is transparent and ungameable. They're going to lose attention as the event goes on, like anybody does. We only have a finite number of mental resources, and as soon as we're drinking, those diminish rapidly and on a hockey stick curve. They can be placated with lots of food, which is something that you also want to have on hand to counteract the effects of the alcohol. This kind of plays into the legality stuff that you need to think of for live events. Obviously, you don't want to have people leaving your venue and then have the responsibility of having something terrible happen. So it's really important to have hydration and food really, really available for folks. And it's very easy to run out of that because guess what? Catering comes out of your pocket. And if people eat through the catering twice as fast as you think they were going to, well, oops, you can't fix that with money unless you order some pizzas real fast. And again, despite the difficulties that these guests and the crowds can present, there's no event without them either, right? Somebody's got to buy the tickets and somebody's got to come up and support these bartenders. So the venue is sort of like the third leg of this stool. Like we saw, I remember on the keynote, Rob's mic was a little spotty. So the sound system, even at a Las Vegas resort, will fail. It's certainly going to fail in your venue. Guests are going to gather in the least convenient areas and create choke points. So this is kind of like, if there's certain doors that people are not allowed to be blocking because of fire code stuff, you got to know that, and you got to have a plan to prevent them from doing so, because if the fire marshal shows up mid-event and no bartender wins because of it, those bartenders are going to be a little salty. yeah, it's going to be real hot. People are drinking, people are milling, and people are vigorously shaking things. So the temperature control, climate control is also going to be an issue, way more so than it is when people are just calmly going through your tasting room. And toilets, yeah, they're going to clog. That sort of traffic is just not what they're used to. So, and ice, yeah, as I mentioned earlier, almost inevitable that you're going to run out of ice your first time. So these are just things that I've seen over the course of running several of these events. So best to, if you don't have an ice maker on hand, if you're not partnering with a bar with an ice maker, best to really be generous the first time and make sure you have as much as you need. And then that's something that you can circle back the second time you run an event and say, how many bags did we buy last year? How much did we have left? Great, we'll buy that same amount, or great, we'll buy a couple extra. That's something that you can measure and kind of elaborate on and get better at as time goes on. This is my small print slide that I was referring to earlier. This is sort of the course of action that I would recommend when you are trying to plan a live event for the first time. So if you've never done this, I'd recommend checking out this slide and using it as your template. Just to go over the big picture headings, ask questions. You want to get all of the big who, what, when, where, whys, and hows on paper first, and use those to inform everything else. Next, you have to define your goals, right? Just like it is with with digital competitions, if you don't have specific goals in terms of how many people, certain types of relationships or vendors that you want to further your relationships with. The other thing about live events is that these are great ways to ingratiate yourself with people like distributors, with people like influencers in your area, right? So if you have people that you want to judge, well, offer your distributor an opportunity to come and be an esteemed judge at this event and drink for free at your distillery for a night and bring a guest, right? This is a great way to further those relationships and kind of get people into the distillery who you want to be there and with whom you'd like to have deeper, better, more mutually beneficial relationships. Blast and refine. This is an important one. This is the digital aspect of the physical competition. You want to make sure that you have everybody in your digital network aware that this event is going on. And as you blast out emails and social media posts, both to your followers and to the people who you may potentially want to come and bartend at this event, they're gonna maybe have some questions. They're gonna give you some feedback. And it's really important, even before the event takes place, that you're listening and that these people may be giving you signals of certain things that you can refine before the event or that you can clarify so that the event itself runs smoother. So blast out the information about the event and then listen to see if you're getting feedback that might give you an opportunity to refine how the event runs. Assembling the team, like an army, it helps to have a single person who's responsible for keeping the event running on time. You want to have one person responsible for that run of show, and it may or may not be the same person depending on the size and style of your team as the person who's doing the social media or the person who's who's getting the venue ready. It may be the same person, it may not. That's going to be something for every operation to decide. But it's important to have one person that everybody listens to when they say, hey, this needs to happen. Everybody else needs to fall in line behind that person. They own the schedule and they own the logistics. They also should be the head cat wrangler when it comes to the bartenders because they will have all the answers. And then finally, once all that work is done, your job gets even harder because the day of the event is always a long day. You've got a lot more people in your space than you're used to having or in this restaurant or other venue that you're not used to being at. And nonetheless, you need to make sure that you're constantly, maybe somebody besides the bartender wrangler needs to be looking, are we blocking fire exits? How are we doing on ice supply? All right, is there a bartender who hasn't showed up yet and the event starts in a half an hour? Like something like that. You want to have your eyes constantly on circle for things that represent lulls in the action, where people are getting bored, represent perhaps running out of water, running out of food, all these things then that can create problems for the space in terms of whether people are engaged or in terms of whether people are perhaps getting overserved. These are things that you need to constantly be really on top of until that last person is out the door and you get to give a big sigh of relief and then start cleaning up a sticky mess. So case study here. We've run an event several times now, actually once before COVID, 2019, and then once post-COVID in 2022 in December. It's the McClintock Distilling Holiday Bar Room Blitz. And this is also a charity event. You'll notice that a lot of distilleries do tend to, incorporate a charitable aspect to this. So maybe a trend to pay attention to and try and work into your event if it makes sense. It's definitely a good look. But so the reason why it came back in 2022 is because all during the pandemic, people kept on coming into McClintock Distilling and saying, when are you going to do the Barroom Blitz again? When are you going to do it again? And so I emceed the first one, and they came back and said, people won't leave us alone about this. Let's do it again. So we ran it again in 2022. And this is a great example of what I was talking about earlier with that sort of iterative, cyclical approach to running these competitions, because these guys are really on top of it. They run a great distillery. They're really smart, and they took copious notes. They had like a little post-mortem after the first event. They took notes, and in 2022, several years later, a pandemic later, they were able to pull up those notes and sit down with me and say, hey, here's how the event went the first time. Maybe we can make tweaks to these couple things and do an even better job than we did the first time. And obviously, the first one was well received because people kept asking for it. So the key features here. I'm a big proponent of welcome cocktails. It is great to have somebody walk through your door and immediately be handed something that makes them feel welcome and makes them understand that you are here to drink and have a good time. Nothing does that better than a large format welcome cocktail. That's easy to execute, and it's a pretty light lift for your distillery team. The bartenders don't even need to be involved in this. It can be very, very simple. And then what happened, so we had a couple of rounds to this event. This is a unique structure to this event. This might work for you, might not. But the way that we set it up is that we had something like 6 or 8 bartenders, and they had stations throughout the distillery space, and they had a cocktail that they had developed using McClintock Distilling spirits. So McClintock makes everything from vodkas and gins to whiskeys to liqueurs. So they had a lot of different variety of options to choose from, and they created a custom cocktail using something from McClintock. And the nice thing about this is that they were able to do some pre-batching, which took some of the serving pressure off of them. They weren't pouring and shaking cocktails individually. They were able to kind of pre-batch some stuff before the event so that when people came, they were able to quickly serve them and sample so that people could sample all 8 of the bartenders in a reasonable amount of time. So we had about 45 minutes where people would walk around, sample, talk with the bartenders who were there not only representing a charity of their choice, but they were also there representing their bars, right? So it's a great opportunity for them to get in front of people who may not have been to their bar for the first time. This is a great way for you to give value to the bartenders. So after that first round, when they were sampling, the people had, we gave them 2 tickets, and they were able to use those tickets just as dumping them into a little bin for their bartender. And at the end of the People's Choice round, we tallied those up. And this was a fun little piece of robustness we built in. Because we gave them 2 tickets, that would allow them to, if they were there in support of a particular bartender, they could feel like they were stuffing the ballot box for that bartender and give both tickets to that one person. Or if you're more of just like somebody who's just there to enjoy and have a good time and doesn't know any of these people and just wants to have some nice cocktails, they could vote for their 2 favorite, right? So we built a little bit of flexibility and robustness into the voting, but because we had twice as many tickets as there were guests, it also made it far less likely that we were going to have a tie, and ties suck. So that's how we set it up. After that, we had 2 winners, and those winners subsequently would advance, and this is something that we'll talk about in our takeaways here. We actually made some modifications to the structure after that People's Choice round. The first year we did it, we had a panel of judges. And so if you're going to have judges, it's important to make sure that those judges are using some sort of template to inform their scores. So this is a very basic one, 1 through 5, 4 times. So this is a score out of 20. I've also judged cocktail competitions where we've scored up to 100. So important takeaway here is the more granular your score can be, again, the less likely there will be a tie. And even at that competition where we had 3 judges rating out of 100 potential points, we still actually had a situation where there was a tie. So ties come up way more often than you would hope. And in the event that that happens, again, as you're setting up your competition, this is the type of granularity you want to get down to of like, what do we do if there's a tie? Do we have a quick speed pour? Do we take the 2 bartenders that tied and give them 1 minute to make a cocktail and have a quick speed pour round? I don't know. Do we have the logistics? Is the space set up for that? Or do we have to have some other contingency lined up? Because the last thing you want to do is lie about it and just randomly pick one of the bartenders because they're going to ask what their scores were. So I promise, all of these things have happened in cocktail competitions that I've run or emceed. So the takeaways here. In 2019, we had those judges, as I mentioned. It was fine. It worked out. Everybody had a good time. But we actually dropped that format in 2022 in favor of a 100% audience choice format so that feelings wouldn't get hurt. When you have judges, I find that judges are great in a primary market when you can have bartenders who are looking to who feel like they're at the top of their games, who are living and breathing mixology. It's great to have judges there because those people don't really have any excuse to take the feedback harshly. This is feedback that they need if they want to get to that elite level. But perhaps you're in a secondary market and you're working with bartenders who are maybe a little bit less sophisticated, that's a situation where sometimes that feedback can bruise egos a little bit. Right? If you're still working on managing a solid shake for a sour cocktail, you don't want to get, some very innocuous feedback can really bruise your ego and kill your enthusiasm, and that's not what you want at a competition like this. So what we ended up doing in the second time we ran this competition is that first round winners were turned into team captains, right? So after the first round, guess what? Nobody gets cut. Everybody still gets to participate, and we just did a second secret ingredient round where the team captains kind of got to lead everybody, and their charities were the ones who got the most amount of money donated to them. All of the charities in these events got money given to them, but the prestige of winning the People's Choice round is that your charity kind of got more money given to it. Secret ingredients we chose for the first year were a little contentious for a secondary market. We used hot honey, which was okay. But then we also used like a kind of a funky kraut pickle brine type thing, and that ended up in some strange concoctions being made. And that might be fine for somebody like you or I who's like, ooh, that sounds kind of fun. But for your average attendant of these cocktail competitions in a secondary market or a craft distillery, they're gonna be like, I don't like that. That tastes like pickle juice. You don't want to do that to the people. So we decided to kind of tone things down a little bit. We went with a sweetener, blackstrap molasses, right? Still sweet, you can make a syrup out of it, and verjus, which is just sour grape juice. So essentially, we took a sour component and a sweet component, knowing that any bartender could make a sour or an old-fashioned out of that. We kind of, and so in that second iteration, we had much more successful mystery round cocktails. So it's not just about the bartenders, you also want to make sure that the people who are attending this event don't get stinker cocktails at the end. And then finally, prep work. This is mostly on my end. I showed up to the first event with like 2 juicers from the 70s and like sat there juicing citrus for like an hour and a half before this event. But in the meantime, they were able to open up a cocktail bar and they had a cocktail program. So I said, hey boys, guess what? Your cocktail team is going to make all of the fresh prep work for us. And they said, great, we can do that. So that was a way that we took the feedback from the first event and the things that we had to do that were pain points from that first event, and we said, well, cool, we can do this now, and that's going to make our lives much easier. So I do want to spend a little bit of time on the multi-round competitions. This is kind of your major takeaways. The nice thing about these competitions is that they're still worth studying, even if you are trying to do a craft distillery event. because if you look at what all the big players are doing, you can find ways to implement that in your kind of smaller scale competitions. So for example, I have an interview with a bartender who was just recently in Diageo World Class, and he was describing to me, unfortunately, he didn't feel comfortable snapshotting all those materials and having me share them up here with you today because, you know, Diageo might find out, and he didn't know if that was quite cool. But he said that when he got flown out to this World Class event for the finals, they had an entire run of show. They had all of the info. They had this really in-depth schedule. They had very specific information about precisely how each round of the competition was going to go. They had information about the judges. They had a packet about their brand values. So if these people were going to be making cocktails using Diageo products, the Diageo made sure to inform the bartenders exactly what the values that they were trying to project with those products were, so that these bartenders could build those values into the kinds of cocktails that they were making. You know, sustainability was a big one that they influenced. So by studying these larger competitions, you can still kind of get some really good ideas about things that you might be able to implement for your own competitions. Now, I'm not saying that's something you may want to do for the first year, but if you run an event, you survive, and you decide you want to iterate and do a second one, maybe worth your time to kind of scout out some of these larger competitions and see what you can learn from them, see what you can get inspiration from. Defining, measuring, and scaling value. This is what happens when the dust settles. If you follow the template that I mentioned earlier, where you establish the big who, what, when, where, whys, and hows, and then you ask really pointed questions about the types of value you want to get out of these events, then you can do what the guys at McClintock did and run a post-mortem of how the event actually went. And you can say, all right, here's what we said before the event. Here's what we said we want to get out of this. Did we actually get that out of this event? And if you're honest with yourself, it doesn't really matter if the answer is yes or no. Because if the answer is yes, then you say, great, we've got something to build on next year. And if the answer is no, you can stop the bleeding and you can say, whoa, okay, we need to step back and we need to radically think about how we restructure this. Hopefully, you can leave this seminar being able to avoid some of the big logistical pain points like not enough food or, you know, too many bodies, fire marshal, et cetera, clogged toilets. Those are very easy to avoid logistical things. Some of the harder to pin down things are pertaining to value. And the funny thing is, like the second you commit to running a cocktail competition, unless you want it to immediately be a sunk cost as soon as that event is over, you kind of have to commit to doing it again and again. So this is not an insignificant commitment if you want it to eventually be efficient and profitable for your brand. Bigger events drive more impact and profit, but only if you're able to maintain that quality as you scale. So if you're moving from a digital event to a physical event, you got to make sure that that value can scale somehow, that can translate somehow. And if you, let's say, this is just a for instance, but let's say you run an event at your distillery for a couple of years in a row and it becomes so successful that somebody wants to come and have you host a similar type of event at a state fair where instead of having 100 people capacity, maybe you have an event capacity of like 500 people. How does that then scale? That's a lot more eyes on your product. That's a lot more people, but that's also a lot more ice, a lot more variables to consider. So as the value and the impact and the profit scale, the quality is going to be harder and harder to maintain. So that's why I'm really hammering down on like define what you want, find a way to measure it, and then find a way to circle back and ask that tough question of like, did we actually get what we said we wanted out of this? So we've talked a lot about the value for brands, so I don't want to really belabor too many of these points here. But I do want to focus on the bottom stuff. As I mentioned with the digital competition, so too with the physical competition. You want to generate reusable evergreen photo and recipe assets. If these bartenders are at your space or on your social medias creating cocktails for you, you want to make sure that you own those cocktails later on. And, it would be really sweet of you if you then kind of attributed those to the bartenders who created them. because that's going to get the repost, right? And that's going to get them, if, for example, you have a cocktail menu, that's going to get them bringing their friends and family in and say, oh, hey, look, my name's on this menu, right? That's great for them. The name of the gentleman from Ireland?
Oh, David?
David, from, what's the name of the distillery?
Short-Cross.
From Short-Cross. David from Short-Cross came up and showed me a video that he took. They have run a cocktail competition 2 years in a row. The first year they did a great competition, he said, but the second year, he showed me this stunning video that they took. And they planned a lot of that event around the ability of a videographer to showcase these cocktails that these bartenders were making. And the video was so high quality that you could screenshot any still frame of that video and use that as a beautiful piece of photo content. So he generated, by paying a photographer, videographer for the course of a 3-hour event, he generated this beautiful digital asset that he can now use in perpetuity. So in addition to the recipes, you also want to have those social media and digital photo and video assets. Also, getting bartenders used to mixing with your products. If you're a new brand with a new space, this is super important. Use that new space to get these bartenders in and get them used to mixing with their products, because if you're hoping to kick somebody else off the bar shelves in favor of your SKU, you're going to need somebody on your side more than just your sales team. You're going to need bartenders on your side. So getting them used to mixing with your products, educating them on that is huge. And of course, we all know the value of getting brand exposure. Regarding prizes, had some feedbacks from a few bartenders that I know and respect and who've done a number of cocktail competitions. We've mentioned the charity aspect as a great way to get around some of the potential legal or ethical loopholes of giving money to bartenders in exchange for pouring your booze. But Dan, who's my friend from DC, makes a great point here. Education is huge. And as I mentioned several times, bartenders are trying to use these events as resume boosts for them. So if you can give them something else, like a free WSET course or something like that, that also helps them boost their resume and helps them advance through their career, that's also huge. In many cases, they prefer that. It's better than brand swag. It's better than a little cash prize. And it makes them feel that you are on their side. Having bartenders feel like you are on their side, even when you have to put up with their nonsense logistically, is a huge win for you, because that's is a super scalable asset in that you now suddenly have an informal brand ambassador. This is Mike Vanderhorn. He was the gentleman who attended Diageo World Class this year. He's actually a home bartender turned professional bartender who was able to get to the finals in this event as a home bartender. And this is a great point that, again, I mentioned earlier, but even the people who don't end up winning need to feel like the event is a win for them, right? So some sort of brand education, some sort of charity that they get to pick and that they get money donated to, regardless of whether or not they win, is a huge thing, right? And this also is kind of one of the reasons why we changed that format slightly, so that they would be getting a little bit less of that critical feedback, especially when they were kind of working at a slightly, maybe a lower level than some of these big market bartenders that I might encounter in DC. And this is my friend Chris from the Home Bar Awards. He's the one who ran that really successful digital event. He had hundreds of thousands of followers when he was running these events super regularly. And I think he makes a great point here. For a brand to stand out, it's important to get creative with the competition theme. Bartenders do want to be challenged. So having a cocktail competition where people come in and simply mix with your product is great, but another thing to put on your plate for that iteration as you're looking at past events and saying, how can we make the next event even better, might be to say, all right, we did the vanilla approach the first time. We had people come and mix with our products. How can we get some fresh ideas and fresh themes in here that are maybe relevant right now and that get people excited to come back for this second event? So challenging bartenders is important. Secret ingredients is a great way to do that. But as I mentioned before, it's important to know what you're doing with those secret ingredients, because they could burn you and they could burn your bartenders. Last up, I've got some resources. So if you go to the Modern Bar Cart YouTube channel, I have a cocktail competitions playlist. This is useful for you if you've never run a cocktail competition as a brand. If you want to see what they look like, I've got video from the McClintock Barroom Blitz. I've got video from a Catoctin Creek cocktail competition that was actually held at a cocktail bar. So if you want to see you just want to see video of what it looks like to have people in those different spaces and bartenders mixing in those spaces, it's great to just take a look at those videos. They're not long, and it'll allow you to kind of imagine those types of people, those types of guests, and those types of bartenders into the spaces that you're imagining. And then I also have, as I mentioned, a run of show template that was not in this deck, as well as a cocktail score sheet. I'm happy to share those with you, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have about setting up events in your venue or another venue, or anything that's involved with getting these things logistically rolling, because they are complicated. And so just please use me as a resource. And I think at this point I do want to open up the floor to questions, because I imagine we're running a little bit late.